Hi, I'm Addison K. Witt, Poet Laureate of the Defense of Democracy and host of this podcast. The attack on America's public school system isn't slowing down, but neither are we. Here you'll meet authors, educators, students, and defenders from across the country who aren't just sounding the alarm, they're answering it. You'll be informed, you'll be moved, and if we've done our job right, you'll be ready to stand with us. This is the Defense of Democracy podcast. Let's get into it.
Joining me today is the director, producer, cinematographer, and editor of the film, The Americans, Hyunsoo Moon. Welcome to Rise with Addison Witt and the Defense of Democracy. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I initially contacted you because we ourselves have the Defense of Democracy Film Festival, and I had been looking for films and projects that could possibly align with us, and I stumbled upon your film, The Americans. And I thought this sounds really, really good. So when I reached out to you and saw that, unfortunately, the timing isn't quite going to work because you are in your final stages of production. But nonetheless, that's okay. I thought it would still be a great idea to talk with you online. So let's have a conversation today. Tell us about yourself and your background as a filmmaker.
Well, first, thank you for having me on. And I guess I, I guess I always loved film since growing up, just movies in general. And I did a little bit of acting when I was in high school, and then ended up going to Emerson College in Boston for film. And from there, I first started working after I graduated. First started working as a location scout, actually. It was at the time, around 2006, 2008, when all these films started coming to Massachusetts because of the tax break. I did some location scouting and location managing, and at the same time, I was doing some editing and making films of my own, like short films and documentaries. And someone said, "Oh, if you know how to edit, that's a good skill. That's like people will pay you for that." It's like, "Oh, really? I didn't know that." And this was when reality TV was really kind of booming.
Yes. Okay.
And reality TV, editors are the king, because they're the ones who actually make this kind of like pile of stuff,
Come to
work.
life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I moved to LA and got a job through a friend at the place where they made Duck Dynasty. I kind of started working in reality, and then I started, and reality was like not something that I really wanted to do. At the time, I really wanted to get into scripted television and movies and things like that, because that's what I, grew up watching. But at the same time, I started working in documentaries, and it was something that really spoke to me. It was the first documentary that I worked on was this feature film called "Give Me Sex, Jesus," and it was about the purity movement and the people who have had experience coming out of with the purity movement and their experiences of sexuality and things like that. And I grew up Christian, not Christian anymore. But it was something that really spoke to me, and it was when I started editing it. I remember this feeling of, oh, I'm supposed to be doing this. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This feels correct, and I really felt kind of I belonged in a way, and this is what I'm meant to do, is to kind of help these stories kind of come to life in a dramatic way that wasn't going to be untruthful, which I think a lot of the times reality TV can be, because so much of it is about creating drama instead of amplifying or just kind of like putting the truth in like a story format. And I think there is a difference. So from there, I did some work in scripted, but every time I worked on documentaries, I really felt kind of alive and pulled into it. And so I started editing a lot more documentaries. And one day, I was like, I always wanted to direct one of my own. And I was kind of tired of getting notes from people. And I was like, I don't want to get notes anymore. I want to just like do what I want. And so I started looking for a project to direct on my own, and that's how I stumbled upon this film. Which I guess I don't know. Should I go into that as well? How I
Well, it's very interesting because I have a reality TV background as well. I worked in a number of reality series in the United States, in Canada, in England, and I loved my work. It was a lot different, most likely, than most reality shows because I worked with a lot of canines, a lot of dogs with
Oh
my
wow,
work.
okay.
So it was a
Yeah.
completely different experience, but and we can't upset the dogs too much. So we
Yeah,
had
yeah.
drama, but it was very controlled drama.
Right.
With that being said, I do find it interesting that you went from Give Me Sex Jesus to now this project that you're working on. So tell us, how did you? What drew you to Storm Lake, Iowa, and how did you connect with this story?
I first wanted to make something about meatpackers. I had seen at the time some documentaries and projects like that focused on treatment of animals and the meatpacking industry's treatment of animals and how the cruelty and all of that. And I thought it was I thought it was odd that we focused on the animals but not on the people who have to do this terrible job.
Hmm.
Somebody's got to do this job, and it's not a job that I would say anyone who's a parent, if their child says, I want to start working at a meatpacking plant, I don't think they're necessarily going to be happy about that, right? Like no 5-year old dreams of working at a meatpacking plant.
Right. No
Um,
one ever said this is a job you should aspire to
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I thought, but it's a job that supports all of us.
and
You
is
know,
necessary.
yeah, and it's necessary. So, I mean, sure, I'm sure vegetarians and vegans would disagree, but many of us, majority of the population that's supported by the proteins that's supplied by the meat industry is pretty big. So anyway, so yeah, I started looking into the meatpacking plants all over the country to see, what it's like to be a meatpacker. And something that I discovered was that there are many, many meatpacking towns all over rural America that's filled with immigrants. This is a very common thing because and because in order to work at a meatpacking plant, you don't need a high school degree and you don't need to speak English. And a lot of these people, immigrants and refugees, they're willing to do this job and they pay at a much higher rate than most jobs in terms of, not have, especially when you compare it to jobs where you don't need a high school degree or speak English.
Sure.
So, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. That these rural America small towns are filled with immigrants, and me being an immigrant as well, I really connected to that. So I started looking at all these different towns and the different makeups, and then I kind of stumbled upon Storm Lake. Partly because the newspaper editor there, Art Cullen, he's sort of a famous person within like the press. He's sort of become a voice of the Midwest, and he won a Pulitzer some years back for his investigation of I think the water treatment plant there and how that has been actually affecting agriculture. So so I started talking to him and just asking him about the different parts about the different ways that the town has changed. And, this town was quasi famous for having immigrants there. Like Katie Couric did a little special there for Nat Geo. The police chief there at the time, Mark Prosser, he's a huge a proponent for immigrants and very very much really he's very much involved in immigration and just speaking out and proponents of immigrants and so I and this was back in 2019 during Trump's first term, and I really thought, okay, here's a town that made a lot of effort to welcome immigrants. This felt different. I looked at some of these other towns, and there were some other towns that there was like some sort of a bombing or close to bombing that happened, and I forget exactly which town at this point. But it was at a time when there were all these like kind of rhetorics on the kind of anti-immigrant sentiments that were happening when people were coming into these towns. And here was a town that really, all the people, like whether it's the mayor, the superintendent, the police chief, the newspaper editor, all these people did make some effort to kind of welcome immigrants. And I thought, I would love to tell a story that's based on that, based in a town of warmth and what it actually looks like when people are welcoming, so that's sort of how I began to kind of delve into Storm Lake and the community there and try to help tell their story. So yeah.
That is really, really interesting. And I definitely want to explore more of that, because that sounds like the town itself and the people that made up the city understood that this is a very big part of their infrastructure and resources. And it was important enough to them to be welcoming when other areas, other states, cities were confronting a much different type of relationship with migrants, immigrants, people who were coming from outside the U.S. Since you did bring it up, you and your family immigrated to the United States when you were 11 years old. How personal does this go for you? How personal is this film for you?
I mean, it's deeply personal. It's the reason why I kind of focused so much on, the film is so much about sort of generational differences that we have. When my parents came here, they cleaned houses. They did whatever they could to kind of, keep us fed. And it's something that I'm very grateful for. But there's also this kind of culture difference that I have from them where, they're fully Korean and I don't feel I'm the what you call a 1.5 generation, 1.5, because I feel partly Korean and I feel partly American. I don't belong in either. And that's a feeling that I've always sort of, it's something that I remember watching Past Lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, that's me. That's literally me. And I'd never heard anyone tell that story before, And so that type of generation, having a feeling of generational difference, but also honoring my parents, that was all sort of part of, those are all stories that I kind of wanted to tell through these people, and that's sort of the design behind the film as well, because there's basically Sam, who came here in the aftermath of the Vietnam War in the 80s. There's Anna and Jephthah, who are in their 30s and came here, much older. And then Eller, who's much younger and came here when she was 5. And and you can see the sort of differences in how they think and the kind of dreams they have. So yeah, but there's something kind of um, that connects all of them in some odd ways, and those are the kind of commonalities that I really tried to kind of marry together in the film as this like kind of singular narrative. So yeah.
We talked about a little bit about my life in Los Angeles. I lived in Los Angeles for many years exclusively, and had lots of friends from around the world: Europe, Africa, Asia, Canada. And they were people pursuing a career in the entertainment industry for the most part, not everyone, but many. And we would often talk about the American dream and the power of the American dream and how much it influenced them in the same way movies influenced me as a kid here in our country. But for someone outside the country, they were enormously influenced by American entertainment and the American dream in and of itself, and came here looking to explore, expand, take advantage of the American dream. I'm wondering, when you hear the American dream today, what does it, or what did it actually mean to the people that you were filming?
I mean, there's a part in the film in earlier in the film where I ask Sam. He is, I think, is in his like late 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and he came here in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. He's Laotian, and I asked him, "Hey, when you came here, did you have any dreams like of having like a home, car, and a family? Like did you have any idea of like what you could have?" And he said no. He was like, uh I was like, he basically said, I just didn't know how I was gonna live. How am I gonna eat? How am I gonna work? Like how am I gonna make money? Like how's that gonna happen? So it's I thought that was a really telling moment about and that sort of goes to what different generations idea, this idea where um American dream, I think, means different things for different people. And many of us who get to dream of, say, yeah, working in the entertainment industry, I think end up standing on the shoulders of people who have provided all the necessities that I grew up with, like not having to worry about money, not having to worry about where my food is going to come from. Like there's a wonderful scene in that television show John Adams some years back with Paul Giamatti. And I think he's visiting France. There's a scene where he's visiting France as like an ambassador. And they're talking about the arts, and they're talking about opera, and they're talking about all these things. And they ask John Adams, like, hey, like, do you have any thoughts on, the arts? Do you have interest in the arts? And he's basically, I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to paraphrase it. He says something to the extent of, I have to study law. I have to study the law, the word, and the legal system so that my children don't have to worry about those things, and that their children can one day be able to have the luxury to be able to create art, to have the freedom to dream of doing those wonderful things. And I always think that's the truth. I think that I always thought that was a really wonderful moment of thinking about ourselves within the context of humanity and say, what needs to happen right now for us so that our children could thrive. you know so yeah, I think there's something, to me, I guess that's where the American dream, I think in the beginning of the film, of making the film, I would say that I did have a sense of wanting these people to succeed in some kind of, I don't know, some sort of way that they could come out of meatpacking and have a better life and all that in sort of a simplistic way. But yeah, as I made the film, I think I just gained a deeper appreciation of what that really means in terms of the American dream, the pursuit of happiness, and how so much of it is acceptance of where you are and being able to say, you know what, this is what I can do to accept happiness and provide for my children who can go on to dream of something bigger than me.
It sounds like your own perception of the American dream was um, also impacted during the filming of The Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, there was I'm gonna spoil the movie a little bit. But this was like a big moment for me because, Jephthah, one of the characters who's, Karen, he's from Myanmar, and they've been, group of people have been persecuted for a long time. And, Jephthah, when I first met him, he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna get the GED, so I can get a better job." I was like, "Oh, I wanna follow that story. I wanna be with you when you study the GED. After you get off your long shift and do all these things, like, and then you go off and quit this job and find a better job. Like, that sounds great. Um, and I followed his life for like, I followed him for like 5 years. And he kind of started to study for the GED, but then it didn't really happen. And I was really disappointed by that. I was really disappointed because I did want to tell the story of the hardworking immigrant in a way. And I was really sad, and I was like, "Gosh, should I cut him out of the film?" Like, I don't know. Like, it's. I was having those moments, and at some point, I think it was like 4 years later, he had quit the meatpacking plant and started working at Walmart. And I confronted him. I set him up in an interview, and then I showed him a clip of him talking about 4 years ago, saying like, "Hey, like, you said you were going to get the GED. Like, what do you think? Like, do you think you were naive, in thinking that?" And he basically said to me, when I was in Thailand, um, at a refugee camp, or because he was like, I was born in a jungle
Mm.
with like a couple of other families. That's where I grew up, you know. Um, and so when I would see planes fly by me, I could have never even dreamt that I could get on a plane. And I heard about America, and I could never have dreamt that I could come to America. Like, I never even thought about coming to America. So coming here was like it was like outside, beyond my dream, you know. And then when he said when I came to America and walked into a Walmart, he said, "Wow, place is amazing."
Mm.
And I, like it's so you could have all these things. And he said, "I could never work here. I could have never." At the time, I could have never even dreamt of working at a Walmart. But now he's like a team lead at a Walmart, working there and providing for his family. And he's like, there are all these things that I never even dreamt of, and it happened for me. So I'm really happy where I am, And I was, I don't know. That was a really humbling moment for me, that I had this kind of like set idea on reaching happiness, reaching the American dream. And I think that's why, that's one of the big things that I kind of am shifting in my own life, and thinking in the idea of happiness isn't something that you pursue. It's something that you accept into your life and say, this is where I'm supposed to be and this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think it's a tricky balance of, it's not, that doesn't mean that you're going to not strive and work hard for those things, but I think there is something really wise and beautiful about the way he accepted his life, within the scope of things. So yeah, I think that was a big moment for me in sort of shifting my perspective.
You mentioned the 5 years of following part of his story and the amount of time that it's taken to shoot and create this film. Documentary filmmaking requires time, dedication, commitment, um, and yet you also have to be open to whatever is coming your direction or what's going to happen. Take us into the day-to-day process. What is it like to think about shooting a project over years and coming to some sort of process or getting to the finish line? What is that process like for you?
Really painful. I don't know. I mean, I would say, I mean,
No
I knew,
pain, no gain.
yeah, it really is. I mean, it's taken this, I started this in 2019. My first trip to Iowa was, it was like February of 2019. So it's almost 7 years now. I mean, it is over 7 years. I don't know. I guess this film, of course, we've had some support from Center for Asian and American Media, who has given us support, different forms of sort of grants and support through the years, but it was never enough to for me to quit my day job. My day job has been editing documentaries and other TV shows, things like that. So it's one of those things where I just try to do my best to go and film whenever I can. When in the beginning, it was a lot of like I'd be working on a project, and then in between projects, I would go off to Iowa and film things like that. And then at some point, a lot of my characters actually ended up moving to Milwaukee and out of Storm Lake. And I realized, I can't really get much intimacy if I'm not there all the time, if I can't just at the drop of a hat go film. So we actually, I moved my family to Chicago for about a year. And to be close to Milwaukee. And during that year, I was still working and I had a job, and thankfully the whole remote work thing was a possibility after COVID, yeah, that's how I started. That's how I lived in Chicago for that year and just went off to Milwaukee every other weekend, or if I had to, I could just kind of, at the drop of a hat, just kind of go and film if there were any important events that were happening. So yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. It's not really, it's hard to say what the day to day looks like just because it's such a long longitudinal process, but it's more like, I think I had a sense of what each characters wanted. I mean, I knew what they wanted, and I said that, okay, because ultimately storytelling is what do the characters want and how are they going to get it and what are the struggles, right? And so it was like for Sam, it's getting to retire and work on his farm. And for Jephthah, it was getting a GED. For Anna, this South Sudanese woman, for her, it was getting a nursing degree. And for Eller, it was more, I guess it was more emotional. It was more something that I had to like kind of find, but I felt like I could kind of find it. There was something about the struggle with the cultural difference and the struggle that she had with her parents. And it wasn't quite set, but I think I ended up finding it later. But I knew that there was something to mine there, and I also knew that in terms of plot, I knew that I wanted to film her going to college. That was something that I thought, well, here's a girl who was born at a refugee camp, and she's probably going to end up going to college because she was a good student. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to go to college. And I just thought that in and of itself is like a great, kind of like story to be able to tell. So once I knew that those were the goals, I just kind of kept in touch with them, and anything that sort of felt like it had to do with those goals, I would just go film. And so, yeah, that was sort of my process. And after that, editing is a whole different thing of putting all the footage up there and figuring out what makes sense as a story and all of that. So
Why is it called The Americans?
Because it's a statement,
Mm.
I think, and it's not too, it's like, when I was like 12 or 13 and I came to America, there was one moment, and I grew up in a very white suburban neighborhood called Acton, Massachusetts. It's 90% white. And there was one day I realized, oh, when I walk into a room, people don't see just a guy walk into a room. People see an Asian guy. There's always going to be a qualifier for me. I will never be American. I will be Asian American. And it was a feeling of like being excluded into some club. And for me, it's a statement in trying to remove this kind of qualifier, because, it's like when I think of America, right? When I think of the typical American, I see like a truck with a flag, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's not fair. They don't get to own that identity, and I really do go back to, the first thing that you see in the film is the Declaration of Independence. And this is what I talk about in my crowdfunding video, but I really believe this. I think the Declaration of Independence is one of the most beautiful things that's been written. That all people are created equal, and we have the right to pursue. We have the right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what it says in a founding document of this country. And none of it says like you have to be Caucasian, you have to be from European descent. No, it doesn't talk about ethnicity or heritage. It's a document about that founded this country, and it talks about people's actions, right? It talks about pursuit of happiness. That someone's actions is what people are doing, and to me, that's what qualifies as you being American. That's the national identity for being America. That's why we have the narrative, the American dream, because we do believe in this idea that you have the right to pursue your own happiness. And so, you know what? That's what I want the American identity to be. And it's not trying to, it's like I'm claiming that American identity without having an argument about it. I'm not going to argue about like who is truly American, whatever. No, I'm just going to say it. I'm just going to put my flag on it and say, you know what? These people are American. I mean, they technically are because they're citizens, but on a more deeper level, I guess, yeah, they're Americans because they believe in the pursuit of happiness, and that is what they're doing.
I really like you sharing your point of view there. I remember having a conversation with a friend from outside the country, and this was during 2016 when Trump ran the first time. And I asked my friend if he was voting in the election, the general election, and he says, "No, I'm not, because I'm a citizen. I'm not an American." And I thought that was an
Mm,
extraordinary distinction, because I'd never really heard anyone um, uh, qualify themselves in that way. He
mhm,
and his family immigrated here when he was 9 years old, and so I think so much of it is also perception, what a person is feeling internally, or what is communicated in their environment. Environment plays a huge role. I grew up in Texas, and Texas, of course, well, it's a fact, we are a state that was once its own country. And you are reminded of that when you are, at least at the time I grew up, when you are a child, you are constantly reminded that we were once our own country. And so I always felt very much like a Texan. And that in some respects even trumped being an American. That was part of it. But you had
mhm.
one better. You were a Texan. So much of it is also your perception and where you come from, and the story that's being told. I am curious if, well, you are I believe an Emmy winning editor. And I'm wondering, how did editing shape the emotional truth of your story?
Um, I don't know. It's hard to tell because it's like, it's not something that I wanted to do to edit
Mm.
because um I don't and I don't recommend anybody to do it because it was a painful process for me.
Mhm,
Because
mhm.
I had to I don't know, it's hard to say because I'm sort of feel like I'm in the thick of it, but I will say it almost felt more like therapy session for me in a way because I was editing my own footage and I had to be really forgiving to myself. And I was judging my footage so much that I was not um, being kind to it and giving it life that it deserved. So I've had many versions that is not what it is today. And yeah, yeah, it's editing. I would say it was a yeah, big part of it was kind of trying to be kind to myself, and also at the same time, I think it ended up being sort of what I first imagined from the beginning. In some sense, it's almost like I had a vision of what it could be, and then I went away from it, and then I'm started kind of coming back to it, which is to tell this kind of um I guess one of the big things that happened recently is, I wanted to tell the story based on their pursuit of happiness, not their past, and because I had this like desire to not talk about their pain, um, and at some and but people kept asking like, what's their background, like where are they coming from, and like I was like, oh, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. And recently, I ended up including a lot more of that, and I think it ended up fleshing out the film a lot more. And I guess it was it's a thing where it's hard to tell in terms of discovery of the truth in editing because so much of it kind of ties with the way what I'm going through personally.
Sure.
And I will say the recent kind of personal kind of acceptance and recognition and realization that I had was this idea that there's 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 beauty in accepting pain and sadness, and it doesn't have to be something that is like we don't. that we think of as, in a way that's like positive or negative in a binary way. But that, yeah, these people's painful stories and their past is just as beautiful and worth telling as part of their whole life story, you know? So yeah, I think I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
It does. It does. I mean, because you're talking about your own process, and it's, it's intertwined with what you're
Mhm.
doing. It's your creativity, and it reminded me initially when you were talking about seeing your own work. I think we all cringe from time to time. It's like when you hear your voice for the first time on a recording and you can't believe that that's how you sound. And
Mhm.
everyone else says, yeah, that's it, or what you're doing. And it's always different. We always have our own point of view. And it's a lot, obviously, it's personal. And so we react and respond very differently. So I think that does, in fact, answer the question. I am curious, as you are rounding up your project, you're in post production, finishing up, you are preparing, I imagine, for festival runs down the road and potentially a PBS distribution. What kind of impact do you want this film to have on the national conversation?
Uh, I would hope that it is a reminder for people what this country could be. I think we have been so downtrodden with the kind of effect that this administration's policies are having about America, that um, we are this kind of force that forces people and that hurts people, and it's one of apathy. And I to me, that's not what this country is. There is beauty in what this founding document said, and it's almost like, I kind of want to get back to that, and I kind of want to get to the possibilities of what this country could be, because the people in the film end up finding happiness in different ways and in really kind of beautiful ways. And, that's like what I want to celebrate about this country, and it's something that I've always felt. Um, it's something that I've always felt about, I guess, um, the Democratic Party in a way, where we always have, it's almost like we always have to counter, we are so busy countering the narrative of the other side that we forget, like, well, what's the vision? What is the beautiful vision that we want people to be part of? You know? And to me, the beautiful vision is a country where people can prosper and people can be happy in this way. And I do believe that it exists. And I think it does take a sense of almost being naive in a weird way, and I think it's hard to be, because we are so bogged down with so much narrative that's hateful and negative. And so any sense of this idea of being happy or hopeful feels foolish, and I think that's what people, when say like Mir Zamdani, I think even a lot of people were very skeptical. And I really believe in this. To me, I really believe in this idea that things are not possible until they aren't. It's just people always say, oh yeah, that will never happen, that will never happen, and then a lot of the things, it can. So I do think that it does take a sense of leap to be hopeful, to be a little bit naive about what is possible. And so yeah, I would hope that people can at least just be impacted by, hey, like, this is what it could be, this is what our country could be. And yeah, I would hope that people who maybe didn't was against immigrants or whatnot, that it can sort of at least just kind of open them up a little bit and be like, you might have heard those narratives from Trump about who these immigrants are, but these are the actual human beings. What do you think? Do you empathize with them? Do you connect with them? I'm not going to talk about policy. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm just going to ask, like, do you feel for these people? And I would hope that it plants some sort of seed for empathy and connection in those people in some manner or another. Yeah.
Hyunsoo, before we complete this discussion, is there anything more you would like to add or anything more you want us to know about your film?
No, I mean, that right now we're doing some crowdfunding, and we're actually launching next Monday. I don't know when this will air, but we're doing crowdfunding as on Seed and Spark as part of the AAPI crowdfunding rally. It's going to go from March 30 to April 29th. So you can find our crowdfunding page through my website. It's theamericansdocumentary.com. And I would just ask that just watch the trailer, watch my campaign video, and see if you connect with the message and the emotions of the film. That I would ask that you just kind of either pledge or share the word or something to just kind of help us be able to bring this film to the finish line.
Hyunsoo, thank you for telling this story. The Americans, it is a powerful reminder that behind every idea of opportunity, there are real people carrying real weight. We'll be following the film as it completes and moves into its festival run and hopefully onto a platform where more people can experience it. To everyone listening, this is exactly why documentary storytelling matters. And it doesn't just inform us, it does ask us to see. This is The Defense of Democracy. I'm Addison K. Witt, and we will see you next time.
Let me introduce you to an organization called Defense of Democracy. We're a New York-based nonprofit with chapters across the United States. Our mission is to empower pro-democracy movements at a local level with the goal of protecting the Constitution and other foundational American documents. We have a coalition of like-minded organizations, including faith leaders, veterans, and students, and we work to promote democracy, stand up for inclusivity, and fight censorship and book bans in our libraries and education system. Well, for just $5 a month, about the price of one coffee-type beverage, you can support Defense of Democracy's mission, and you can make a difference in your local community and really in the entire nation. That's just $5 a month. I'm going to say that again. Not a day, not a week, $5 a month. One day out of 30, you can brew your coffee at home and stand up for the America that you know and love. So scan this QR code or visit defenseofdemocracy.org today. Put on a pot of coffee. We got work to do.